webinar, and we're thrilled to have you all here today. This is an issue that we have been working on diligently, and we have a lovely panel with us here today. And we thank you very much for leaning in and with us and learning and listening and keeping our eyes open to be allies as we move forward and commit ourselves to being allies in this space. So we greatly appreciate you being here. And I'd like to give Jessica a round of applause for leading this effort for us and for really doing all the heavy lifting. I just get to come on here and welcome you. So thank you all for being here. And Jessica, great job with the panel and getting us all together today. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate that, all technology issues aside. So we have a great discussion we're going to have today. But first, I'd like to introduce our panel and have them tell you a little bit about themselves and their work that they've done in the DEI space. So we'll go ahead and start with Tauri, who you guys might recognize. She was our panel or our webinar person last summer. So we're happy to have you back. And why don't you go ahead and give us a quick introduction?
Good morning to you all. Hi, I'm Tauri Laws-Phillips. I am an improviser, so improv comedy. I own a theater, and through my theater, I do and have been doing diversity and inclusion trainings for the last 5 years or so. And I adore doing this work, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with these lovely, smart people.
Thank you. And we look forward to getting to bring you out to do some DEI improvising things in person at some point. Next, I'd like to introduce Andrea Smalling.
Hi, I'm Andrea Smalling, and I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Wine Direct currently. And I am not a D&I professional. I'm coming to you really just from my own personal experience as a Black woman in the wine and hospitality space for over 25 years. So I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts with you as we go through this.
Thank you. And next up, we have Justin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Marquez. I use he, him pronouns, and I work as a community development manager at MCE, which is a public agency that provides electric services for the entire communities, for all of the communities within Napa. So part of my work is focusing on engaging with the community there. And obviously Napa is a very diverse county with a lot of different types of constituencies within it. So understanding who we're working with and who our communities are is very important for MCE. In addition to that work, internally, I work with our diversity, equity, and inclusion Tiger team, which is our little name for groups of staff who are working together on joint initiatives. And we're working on internal and external work that improves and champions DEI within all of MCE's work. So I'm excited to be here on this panel. I'm also, not a professional in DEI space like Andrea said, so also coming at this work with passion and personal experience as a queer Asian son of immigrants. So excited to be here, and thank you to the Chamber for hosting this.
Thank you, Justin. And last but certainly not least, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Until Friday, I'm the Director of Diversity Inclusion at Constellation Brands, and I've built their program in diversity inclusion over the last 4 years. And then as of Monday, I will be Sarah Bettman, proprietor, founder, I'm not even sure what to call myself, of Bettman Consulting Group. So I'm taking 10, 15 years of leadership development, executive coaching, team building experience, and going out into the world to help small to medium companies get started on their DEI journey. So at the very, very beginning, when people either individuals or organizations want to do something and don't know how to start, that's where I play. So for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about my role as a white woman and the journey I took to become a practitioner in DEI for the last 10 years. And my perspective is really around kind of that beginning mindset and leadership development needed to successfully lead DEI initiatives.
Perfect. Thank you. And I just want to, we touched on a couple of things when we had our pre-webinar meeting and just want to touch on them as a group. So one thing to remember when we're doing this work is that we're coming to it with positive intent. So just remembering that even if things make you uncomfortable or you say something wrong in this space, that's okay. And this is a safe place to learn and listen. So, we wanted to make sure that when we're talking about this work, we're being, thoughtful. We're recognizing our own biases as we go through this, and then we're really recognizing how much we don't know or have not experienced, and that we're actively choosing to be an ally. So those are kind of our intents that we're going to set over the whole webinar as we go into our panel discussion. So I will go ahead and kick it off. So we're going to have our next part of the webinar will be our panel discussion. We have some topics that we're going to talk about. Feel free if you have a question to type it into the chat or to raise your hand, but we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So first we're going to go ahead and start with Sarah, and she's going to talk a little bit about the mind shift that it takes to really start this work and recognizing your own biases and how you can do that, and her experience with that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll never forget, I was at a diversity best practice event, and the rock stars of DEI, these people who have been practitioners for years, said, we've been doing this for 20 years and we haven't seen a lot of change. And it's hard, meaningful work. And one of the things that I've observed is that leaders want to jump into action, right? Leaders are action oriented. But the work of successfully leading DEI requires looking in the mirror. And it doesn't matter what your background is, we all have to look in the mirror and start to understand, one, who we are in the discussion, but then also understand the dynamics. So I had a recent conversation with a Jewish colleague, and today we're learning about the experience of Jewish people and what's going on in Palestine and Israel. A month ago, we were talking about Asian experience and the history of discrimination and violence towards Asians. We just passed the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd being murdered. And in order to be able to lead in this space and lead with empathy and allow the employees that are affected by some of these dynamics in the world, I can't, we're kind of equal opportunity here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the LGBTQ community and the transgender people that are looking at some of the legislation going on in states all over the country. So in order to lead this, we have to be willing to develop as leaders. And in the same way, you might have had to learn introvert or extrovert, or if you're public facing, you understand cultural dynamics of different culture. This is another layer we have to bring in to learn about difference. And I think one of the fundamental aspects, and I know that's part of this conversation, of how to engage with diverse and a variety of customers that are coming to your locations or that you work with, is really that understanding of what's the experience they want to leave with. Do they want to have, I'm California raised, stoked to have had the experience they had with you? And sometimes being able to know that someone might have a different experience, even you don't have to do anything, but just knowing is everything. So if they come to you or you notice something that they're getting discriminated or harassed, you can step in and be a good ally. And that person leaves knowing they were seen, they were able to be their full selves and be able to, and you become a brand that's in their mind, that's safe and they want to engage with. But again, kind of going back to where I started, it requires all of us to do our individual work and look in the mirror and start really exploring both our own experience, but then diving into some of these social constructs that have deep-seated roots in history that are leading to what we're seeing today.
Can you give us maybe 2 or 3 active examples of how people can start that work or start recognizing that in themselves?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost is if you're tempted to comment. So I'll give you a great example. Black Lives Matter. There were so many who wanted to retort with All Lives Matter. In the pause and just knowing for a second, there's more to know in that debate and conversation. And if you haven't done your work, if you haven't done your research, to pause and get curious. So first is just knowing to pause, and really what it is an emotional trigger. You might want to blurt, you might want to defend, you might, but not me, might be the language you hear yourself. You might even say, I'm not a racist, if you think that in your head. Those are all moments to pause and learn more about the situation that the other person is engaging with you on. So that's one, just pause. Two is then to go explore the specific topic and know you may not like what you see, but here's the catch. Even if it's not relevant to you, it doesn't mean it's not true. And just a quick example is my husband and I have talked, especially when we were first dating, about my experience with safety as a woman traveling alone globally as a consultant. He doesn't relate to walking around with keys in my hands, noticing situational awareness of where my car is parked, who's in the lobby when I walk in after a meeting, that I won't leave a drink on the bar. And he doesn't get that. And he never will, because he doesn't have to engage in the world as a woman. And I'm fairly petite, I'm 5'3", so engaging in that. But he knows that it's true for me, meaning he might notice I rise up, or I might say something silly like, can you come with me to go to the shop? Seems ridiculous day to day, but he knows there's something going on with me that there's no debate. He knows to be a good husband, good partner, good friend to me is not to ask questions and not debate, but go with me. So those are the things that we need to look at, is recognize when our colleagues and friends are saying, yes, that happens to me. Even if we can't relate, we need to know that that's true. And then last but not least, read and apply and study and attend things like this.
Thank you, Sarah. Now I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Justin. Justin's going to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of community members and customers, and recognizing that people are more than one thing and how that affects the work that we do.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I really appreciated what you were saying. So yeah, when I think about intersectionality, that was a new phrase for me several years ago. So I want to break that down. And basically, it's the idea that we're coming into any space, any workplace, any business, wearing multiple identities. So back in college, I was a facilitator with an organization called Sustained Dialogue. And the purpose of that group was to bring together students from across different identities and backgrounds to come together and have a dialogue, not a debate, to talk about some of the different issues that existed on our campus. And one of the first exercises that we did was taking a look at some of the bigger identity categories and taking time to reflect on ourselves and understand, what identity do I hold within that category? And does that identity have power? Is it privileged? Or is it unempowered? Is it disadvantaged? So examples of these categories include gender, race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, ability status. Thinking of these different identities and understanding, where do I fit within that power dynamic within each of these things? That is sort of the spectrum of identities that we all carry at all times within ourselves. And that's an important thing to think about when it comes to, in my workplace, with my coworkers, with my colleagues. All of our different identities that we carry at the same time are interacting with each other. There are power dynamics that come into play every time we're interacting with folks, depending on the identities that we carry. And that is also true for our customers. So when folks are coming into our businesses, when I'm speaking with some of our residents who are receiving electricity from us, understanding and thinking about that these are folks who are coming in who may be a person of color, may be a woman, may be differently abled. Those affect the way that we ought to treat people. Actually, it really shouldn't. It means that we should treat everyone the same. But being cognizant of what those different power dynamics means that you're showing empathy and caring for those folks. And it's also a good sort of reflection to think about yourself and understanding, what is your role in the DEI space? If you're carrying a bunch of identities that have power, if you're a man, if you are cisgender, if you are white, you're going to carry some privilege. And how do you wield that power and privilege is very important. And that will obviously show up very differently in the workplace or in the winery or whatever your business may be. So thinking about these questions, I think, is an important step to making sure that folks feel like they can belong in the space and in our communities. And I definitely encourage folks to go through that exercise and think about that with your staff, or even having a conversation at home with your family and friends. It can go a long way.
Tara, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
I did. You said something that was so rich, Justin, and I figured I would jump in. I would venture to say that we always feel like we should give everyone the same experience and treat everyone the same. But with what you said, I really think from an equity standpoint, equity being that if we treat everybody the same, some people are going to leave with a great experience and some people are going to leave with an okay experience. I think if we can recognize that we may have to do a little more for some people to leave with a great experience by taking into account what things they may be carrying with them. And to say that, I mean that if you are opening the door for everyone coming through a door and everyone gets 3 seconds. Well, if there's a woman with a stroller and a small child, you're going to hold the door for 5 seconds so that she can get through, because her experience isn't going to be awesome if you hold it for 3 seconds and then let the door go. And so our natural inclination is to give her the time that she needs, because she requires more time to do the same thing that everyone else needs, which is to get through the door. And so I think naturally a lot of human inclination is to give everybody what they need to get through, but then we're sort of taught we need to give everybody the same thing, and some people may require more. And so taking that little bit of extra care with someone that you can perceive that may need more is not a bad thing. So just to piggyback it, that sometimes a little extra is wonderful to make sure that everyone truly has a great experience.
Thank you, Tari. And I want to add on to that a little bit too, and how it's worked for MCE. So like I mentioned, MCE is a public agency, and we are providing electric service for Napa County. We recently passed a racial equity resolution at our board, which we were really excited about, and it was definitely inspired by the city of St. Helena had done something similar in the last few months. And part of sort of even establishing that was establishing, what does racial equity mean? And recognizing that equality is equal opportunity, that's important, but we're talking about equitable outcomes. How do we make sure that everyone has the equal outcomes at the end? And in the case of getting into the building, you know, in the same amount of time, that's not going to be the same. That's equality for 3 seconds. But the equity is knowing that that woman or that mother who has a stroller, who's carrying something else, those extra 2 seconds will get her into that equitable outcome. So I really wanted to emphasize that was a great example for that. There's another great graphic too, if you might have seen. There's a baseball diamond. I'll share it with Jessica to share out afterwards, but I think that was a great example of what is equity and what are we striving for.
Tari, I'm going to skip around a little bit than what we had planned. I'm going to have you go ahead and go next and talk a little bit, because it kind of piggybacks really good onto this, about dismantling, you know, the white American norm and what that looks like, and how we need to work on that first to be able to really give everyone that equitable experience and that great experience. And then we'll round it out with Andrea really bringing it home with some real life hospitality examples of what that looks like.
Sure. It sounds like it's going to be a scary thing when it's presented as dismantling whiteness. I would venture to say it's the way that I think about it is this. Let's back up and go to privilege. I recently had the privilege of being in your amazing area, and yes, it was amazing. It was great to see you guys in person, but I can tell you that where you live is an outstanding privilege. Now, that isn't to mean, doesn't take away how expensive it is to live there and the work that you have to do to live there and the downsides. Those things are absolutely a part of it, but you still live in one of the most amazing places on earth. There are a lot of places I'm sure you wouldn't trade for where you live. So I think of that as a privilege. I also think about privilege, all the privileges we have as Americans. We expect that we are protected in so many ways. And not that those privileges weren't fought for hundreds of years and were protected in so many ways because of the amazing parts of being an American. If you have ever lived through a snowstorm, you suddenly, which is not often in Texas, but suddenly I learned the privilege of expecting there to be water when I turn on my faucet, or expecting heat to be there because I pay for it and it's a part of my house. Suddenly it not being there felt like somebody had taken something very precious from me. So there's all these things that we just sort of expect as privilege. And so I personally don't expect people I never expect anyone to be sorry for their privilege. I don't think you should be guilty for your privilege. A lot of the privileges you have, someone worked for, even if you are a fifth generation Rockefeller and you're swimming in pools of money, somebody worked for that money. And so we can thank them, but I don't think you should feel guilty about what they provided for you through their hard work. Also, if you're a Rockefeller, you can Venmo me later. Just kidding. But so I think of privilege in that way. And so we all have privileges. That doesn't mean that we don't, the lack of privilege doesn't hurt or harm us in some way. And so, as the examples earlier, if you are a woman, you don't have the privilege of walking carefree in a lot of places in the world at night, and sometimes during the day, depending on where it is. And so we recognize that though we might have a large number of privileges, there might be other privileges that we may never have. So I think of that way. Now, for us in America, in our society, it happens to be that the stories that are told are from a male white perspective. And so for a long time in our country, those have been seen as the norm, and everything else has been set against that. So if you weren't a white male, then you were different than the norm. And oftentimes, the norm is seen as the goal. And so the properties of that privilege were seen as what the goals were for everyone else. And so I think that oftentimes that can be a long-standing thing to dismantle for us all. I work on it every day. And like I said, I've been doing this for a long time, but it's the kind of thing where you have to think about the language that you use. You have to think about the context in which we create our opinions, whether something is professional or not. Well, what's the standard of professionalism? What's the standard of a good life? What's the standard of good even? And so that's how I talk about dismantling whiteness and masculinity, not as toxicity, but just as the norm or the goal. Because can it be that you can be super happy and have a great successful life without having a different standard of success or happiness? And are those the goals? So I want you to kind of think about that. That's one of those things that requires a lot of thought. As you think of it and sort of uncover that, as you have conversations, you'll recognize yourself and start to question, what's the standard for this? Whether something is good or bad, whether something is successful or not, whether it's beautiful or not. As women, I'm sure you've thought about sort of just dismantling those standards of beauty. Well, for so long, that's what the standards of beauty were. We also, I would also add in for women, that standard of what size is beautiful or acceptable. What a family looks like, what the norm, what that sort of nuclear family of a husband, a wife, and 2 kids, well, what did they look like? were in your mind when you visualize that, is it sort of, leave it to Beaver the Cleavers, maybe? Somebody tell me if I'm wrong. It's fine.
I think that's right.
Okay, good. I'm like, there has to be an 80s or 90s reference, but I never watch sitcoms. If that's the norm for you, well, what does that make a family that has 2 moms or 2 dads, or has 3 kids, or has kids that are adopted from multiple different backgrounds? Why are they a different family, and can they be the norm? And does norm really even need to exist in the context of that conversation? So I think that thought process will start to open you up to being more accepting, because oftentimes we recognize that all of that stuff doesn't matter and the norm doesn't matter in that case. And that, happiness or joy could be the success metric. So I welcome you to do that.
Sarah, I think you have a follow-up.
I do, Tari. I love what you're saying, and I'd like to bring up a topic that's kind of, I don't want to say near and dear to anyone's heart, because it's not really near and dear, but it's an incredible learning opportunity. And that's the incident that happened with the wine train, and talking about what the norm is, right? The measurement, and I'm using a summary. Some of you may be deep in the knowledge, so I'm using a kind of customer high level, how the general population might see it experience. And it essentially was there was a group of women who were loud and boisterous and disruptive, and they were removed from the plane, right? From the train. That is the high level storyline. And again, there may be a lot more detail that I don't want to explore here, but thinking about the person who initially complained, what is the norm? So the norm in Japanese culture would definitely look different, or the norm in German culture would look different. But what would it have looked like if it were an Italian group, or maybe someone of Latin descent that tends to be more effusive and vocal in what they're doing? And we have to start looking at these questions that Tauri's raised in the sense of, would I say the same thing or think the same thing if this was a different group, or if this was someone else, or if this was teenagers or my friends, so that we can start looking through the lens of I'm one of many perspectives versus I am the perspective and everyone is in relation to me. Because when we are centered, whatever our point of view is centered, everything else is then measured against, and we tend to vote they're better or worse, or they're too much or too little. And when we're one of many, we stay in curiosity and interest and in a space that we're not actually voting about another person and how they show up. So I use that as a very real experience to kind of pick through, like, how did you react as the news went out? What did you think happened? And notice with some of the questions that Tari asked, would you think differently now that she's posed these questions about what is the centered norm? And if a norm is being loud and boisterous and having a great, as a way of showing and having a great time, then perhaps it may have been a different scenario. So anyway, I just wanted to share that, because as you were talking about that norm, that was a close example that many of you probably read in the news, or maybe were intimately familiar with, that is an example of where I'm going to go out on a limb and say the norm was probably a more conservative, quiet, formal norm that then this was measured against.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. I knew that wine train would get brought up at some point today. So, Andrea, I'm going to go ahead. That's a perfect segue to have you kind of round us out with, how does what we're talking about, really apply to hospitality, which is our largest sector, and how can we as an industry be more welcoming and equitable in our experience for everyone?
Absolutely. Yes. And it is the perfect segue, both what Sarah and Tori were discussing. As I said, my career has been in the wine industry for over 25 years. So I'm originally from Canada, started with Procter & Gamble there, and then moved to the United States and to California. I've worked with big, large wine companies, and then progressively moved to smaller, more hospitality and luxury focused wineries. And that's when I really kind of, got into dealing with guests and kind of seeing who are the visitors that we see in wine country. Just as a side note, we launched a wine brand at Gallo in the early 90s with television advertising, and we thought we were being pretty revolutionary because the main character in the television ad was a woman in her 30s and not a man in his 60s. That was kind of a big deal, so this shows you that, when we talk about the norms, I think wine country is the extreme version of the norm being, a middle-aged, white, cisgendered, that's who we've been talking to for generations in the wine industry. I'm used to being the only, for sure the only Black woman, and often the only kind of minority represented at all, period. Until the last couple of years, things are starting to change, and that's lovely. But we're at a point now where we're faced with some really new and important realities. The accommodation of diverse groups of people, it's not only a human issue because, it's just something that needs to be done, but it's also an economic one. Talking about the wine train, for example, you hear about these women and what happened to them, and there was a whole lot of people who said, I'm not going on the wine train ever. I'm not maybe going to wine country ever, because clearly I'm not welcome there. So these kinds of things can affect a business really, really quickly, the way news spreads right now. We know that the purchasing power of groups is expanding. And the wine industry knows all too well that the group that we've been targeting for so many years is aging and their purchasing power is declining. So if we don't pay attention to these other groups, not only is it just bad, but our businesses are going to decline. And then the other thing, of course, to consider, again, wine train as an example, is that people, if you don't do the right thing, people know really, really quickly, and the consequences are fast and they're bad. So these are things that we really, really need to be aware of and act appropriately. So given all of this, I thought I'd cover, a few ways that we can all just, as hospitality professionals, especially, although it is applicable just to work environments as well, how can we make people feel more welcome in our environments? So it can be a tasting room, a restaurant, a store, but even your workplace. These are things that we should all be doing, period. But, history has shown that unfortunately, we're not always doing them, especially when we're faced with people who look different from the norm, which unfortunately, we know what that looks like. So, really simple one, greet everyone with a big smile and a hello. That sounds so simple, but I will tell you, for me, when I walk into a space where I'm not quite sure what I'm going into, if you say, big smile, welcome, that just automatically sets me up just to be that much more comfortable. Sincere smile just goes such a long way. It just makes all the difference in the world. The second point I had, and it's funny because both Justin and Tauri brought it up in slightly different ways. What I said was treat all guests equally well. So not necessarily treating them the same, although you can kind of start with that as a mindset, but ensure that everyone has the same great experience. And by this, I mean a few things. If you treat me with the same respect and attention as you do to the 65-year-old white gentleman sitting beside me, I'm going to be good. If I get even a slight inkling that you're paying more attention, or you're assuming that he's going to spend more money, so you're kind of brushing me off and not paying attention to my request, I'm really quickly going to walk out the door and take my money with me. The flip side of that, however, is don't make assumptions about what I want and try to relate to me that way. When we were talking kind of as a panel a couple of weeks ago, one of my pet peeves is when, people see me and they're trying to be nice. I know it's coming from a good place, but all of a sudden they're saying like, girl, I know what you mean, girl, and just using language that I'm like, what? You were not talking like that a minute ago. Why all of a sudden you see me and this is what's coming out of your mouth? Don't make assumptions about anything about me. Whether, for example, I want sweet wines versus dry wines. There's all these things that we hear that we call kind of microaggressions, and they're important. So don't make assumptions and try to relate to me in a way that you think is going to be appropriate. Get to know me first, and then let's move forward. One other thing is, and again, goes back to the wine train as an example of what not to do, act swiftly and decisively if you hear of anyone treated poorly. So if you, for example, hear that someone was being, rude to another person in your establishment or one of your employees or anything like that, don't sit there and say, well, I'm sure they didn't mean anything by it. You need to actively say, this is not going to be tolerated here. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask this person to leave because this is not the environment that we want. And if you don't, again, the consequences can be swift because word gets out. You need to really, really kind of protect everyone in your environment. And then the final thing is really, ensure that you've hired a diverse group of employees and that your marketing materials show diversity and are free of bias. As I said, big deal, early 90s, we showed a 30-year-old white woman at a TV ad, woo, big deal. I will say that I look at ads, I look at magazines, I look at brochures, and I want to see a bunch of different people, age groups, everything represented, because that tells me that everyone is welcome to be there and that, we are all wanted. If I just see, the same people all the time and they're all, again, 60-year-old white people, that's going to suggest to me that maybe I'm not welcome there, or maybe you don't think that I am, the person that you want, buying your products. And this is something that is just really, really important. You want people to visually see that, yeah, this is somewhere I can hang out. This is somewhere where I'm going to be treated well and with respect. And this is somewhere that I want to, spend my money. I guess the final thing that I'll say is, don't run away from the discussion. I know it's tough. It's exhausting. I'll tell you, the last year and a half for me, I've never talked so much about these things in my entire, 50 plus years. And it's exhausting and it can be uncomfortable, but it's also been really wonderful to kind of get our thoughts on the table so that we can do something about it. So, if your staff is kind of rolling their eyes and saying, oh, we've got enough of this, we don't want to talk about it anymore, force the discussion, let them know that it's important and that, this is something that is going to be, really at the forefront of everything that we do moving forward, not just to be good humans, but because we want our businesses to thrive. And this is, the key to growth as an industry overall. That's kind of what I had.
Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, there are so many amazing things. I would say that if your staff is feeling like they're overwhelmed with it, that's okay. Decenter yourself in it, because that's the hard part. We get afraid of it being big emotions. Ultimately, give yourself the kudos for wanting to do the work, but recognize how hard it is, recognize those emotions, and then sort of set the parameters. What you did up top was perfect, sort of like letting people know, hey, we're going to have this discussion. These are emotional discussions. Let's take ourselves out of it and focus on the experience we want our guests to have. One thing I'll piggyback on that Andrea said, when you are different and diverse, people are Googling whether they're safe in a space before they travel.
Absolutely.
So people who are Googling whether Napa is racist.
Yes.
And
yes.
they're checking to see. So they're looking for imagery of people that look like them, but they're also wondering about the experience that they're going to have there. That exists for whether it's tolerant. People that are queer are looking for whether they're going to be safe in a space. And so consider what that must be to want to do a trip, to be excited about a space, and then to worry about your safety in that space, and then to wonder if you can truly be yourself and relaxed in a space when you're going to relax. And I think if we approach it from that point of view, it's really hard not to be empathetic about what that experience will do. And that really changes the perspective. So as you're having those tough conversations at work, frame it that way so that we can really, because you hired great people that care about the experience they give. It's just adding the context of what comes with that for people who may be more diverse and diverse in lots of different ways.
Perfect. Before I ask my final question to each of you, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, I just wanted, Tauri touched a little bit on this, but, these DEI webinars that we're presenting are meant to be a starting point for everyone. But if you're really interested in deep diving into this work with your team, you know, we're happy to give you Tauri or Sarah's contact information or other, you know, people to really, you know, dive into this. This is kind of, you know, a top level conversation. And then, you know, hopefully it sparks deeper conversations within the organizations within Napa County. So final question that each panelist will answer, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. What is one thing that you personally do to be inclusive in your everyday life? And I will start with Sarah, and then we'll go in order.
Yeah, well, I'm going to cheat and do two because I think it's been hinted at. Be authentic. Andrea, I love your example. Like if I start flipping into a different language style, it feels gross. So really, I'm authentically myself. And then I ask myself, how can I be of service of others? So as a white woman in the DEI space, I spend a lot of time of how can I use the privilege I do have as a white woman to elevate others?
Perfect. Justin?
Yeah, I think the one thing I do for a lot of meetings that are external, when I introduce myself, I also introduce my pronouns. I am a cisgender man, but I know that many of my colleagues or family members of my colleagues, and definitely I have family members who don't identify as a man or a woman, they might be trans, they might be non-binary, but introducing and normalizing the idea that we want to let folks know what our pronouns are, you know, having it in our email signature, saying it during meetings is a really easy way to be more inclusive. And it's really simple too. You know, I'm Justin, I use he, him pronouns. And I do have one experience too, where I have a colleague who works at a similar agency like mine, and his daughter had recently come out as trans. And when we were doing the opening intros, he talked about this was so important for me to see as a parent for a trans daughter, understanding what it means to just to share pronouns and having empathy for his own family member, you know. So I think seeing that more in the world is going to be more welcoming for trans and non-binary folks, and I think is a simple way that we can be better allies to the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you, Justin. That was great. Tauri?
Thank you. I'm like, I do so many things. One thing I challenge everyone to do is to consume the media that you like, but with people who are different than you. So if you like comedies, watch a comedy with queer characters and experience the lifestyles of people who look like you in the type of media that you love. Watch movies. If you like dramas, I highly suggest Bollywood dramas because they're real dramatical and super fun. But enjoy and experience. It doesn't always have to be a sort of like emotional labor. You don't have to just consume movies about Black trauma. You can watch Blackish on a Wednesday night, maybe. That's probably the only sitcom I know. But you can watch people who are different than you engaging and having fun in not just consuming trauma. Like our joy is so much a part of our humanity as well. So yes, read the books, but also consume the lightness and the joy and all parts of different cultures. You'll start to really recognize the humanity and different norms really quickly.
Yeah. Excellent. And Andrea?
I'll do a really simple one. Smile. The wine country, I know it doesn't feel like it because we're in it. Wine country is very intimidating for many, many people. And just, you know, being friendly and smiling goes such a long way to just taking it down a notch and helping people understand that, yes, this is the beautiful place that I wanted it to be and I can have fun here.
Ooh, I thought of another one, Andrea. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Make eye contact with people.
Yes. Yes.
I will tell you that as a Black woman, there are so often I am in spaces where people don't acknowledge my existence within the space.
Yes.
And I'm sure you have this experience as well, Andrea and Justin, where people just don't acknowledge that you're there. And simply acknowledging other people can do so much.
Yes.
so much. You would have no idea. So
Mhm.
making eye contact
Yes,
and
that's a great
smiling.
one.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was amazing as always. I'm so happy you guys were able to join us. I know I'm gonna go ahead and open it up for question and answer. Mayor John Dunbar, I know you had something you would like to share.
Yeah, thank you very much. I joined a few minutes late, but it was great to hear this dialogue and I really appreciate it. I wanted to just recognize, I really appreciate that the industry is really taking a serious look at how we can be more diverse and more equitable and inclusive. These are not just words. I think they have been just words in years past. And I think it might have been Andrea that was talking about having really never spoken on this as much ever before. That's a good thing, but it's far from finished. But I just wanted to offer from a local government perspective, and I will just reach over here, highly recommend, even though it looks backwards to me, The Color of Law. It's an example of where government has failed in this space for decades, generations, and we have a lot of work to do. And so it's going to take time. I know everybody wants it done yesterday, but we have to take our leadership roles very seriously as elected officials and advance all of what you are doing. Very quickly, a couple initiatives that I've been a part of. I want to highlight the National League of Cities. I've done a lot of work with the California League of Cities, but the National League of Cities has a real program, Race, Equity, and Leadership, for about 6 years now. And Rita Osolinsky and Leon Andrews run that program, educating elected officials throughout the country on how to advance equity, not just equality, but equity and learning. And I think, Justin, you made a comment about the baseball field analogy. It's in their presentation. When you give everybody the same size box to look over a fence to watch a sporting event, the tall person can see, the short person cannot see, and the person in a wheelchair can't see either. So you need to make it equitable, not just equal. And we need to do that in our land use decisions, in our advancing of socio and economic opportunities. Government has failed in a lot of ways over the years. We have segregated people into neighborhoods and have not given people the kind of economic opportunity and wealth building that other groups have. So that's on us. I am working on organizing a local task force on advancing equity in Napa County, and I am looking to have all ages, all genders, all colors, ethnicities, because there is a space for everybody. Like there's a space for a middle-aged white male voice in this. And so I am, making sure that I am a part of that and looking forward to reaching out to others, some on this call and others, to continue to do that and get away from those stories about how people have learned the hard way that we are far from in a great place here. So thank you for letting me share just a few of those thoughts. And you can count on elected officials really helping be partners in this rather than be resisting going forward.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry, there's a fly. I really appreciate everything that you do and are working towards for our community. Is there anyone else that has a question? Yeah, Gabby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the incredible conversation. I love having these chats. I think for myself, something that I struggle with a lot, and I would love to know sort of how you've tackled this, is how do you deal with feeling like you're constantly the only person in the fight, especially as a woman of color, or even just a person of color, feeling like a lot of the work, if it's not you doing it, then it's like the work isn't getting done, and still feeling hopeful on continuing to do the work, especially since I know some of you said you've been doing this for years. And that's something that I've really been struggling with in the last year, on like feeling like, okay, am I really okay with me continuing to feel like I'm the only one doing this work? And how do I feel empowered to keep going?
I just actually had this conversation with a colleague today, and this was my Jewish colleague, because she's frustrated that her friends aren't reaching out to see how she's doing, and she's tired of always being the one that's reaching out and starting the conversation. The one thing that I told her, and it's not great, but it's one thing to think about, is, and this is for the women on the call with men, for the people of color, for white people, for LGBTQ and cis and straight gender people, is tell them, because sometimes people don't know that they need to take the mantle and take the baton, and then also how. And so where she landed was, I need you to do X, Y, Z, and engage. And that was really important in Constellation, is getting more people involved in the conversation and telling them how, because there are a lot of people that are outside of represented groups that feel like it's not my place. And I hate to say it, but we do have to tell others that, yes, it is your place and we need you, versus waiting and hoping they come in. So I've found it. And then my role is then to echo and say, you, white person, need to be in this space, and this is how you get in.
Yeah. I would add on to that, that you tell them, what you need from them, but also why. And one of the things that I've done, I mean, there's two areas, right? There's one on a personal level. If you feel like your friends are not reaching out, that's one thing. Telling them what you need is really key. From a business standpoint, I find framing it as an economic issue in terms of, here's the benefits of embracing this discussion, because there's all kinds of studies now that show that, diversity in the workforce makes a huge difference as far as the business results, as well as the purchasing power of various groups of people. And I think, framing it that way for people who just aren't quite getting it, but might be more focused on business results, can sometimes get them across the line, and then they kind of lean in a little bit more and understand a little bit more, at least what they will get out of it.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add too, I've felt that in so many different ways. Am I alone in this fight? And the answer, I might think that and I might believe it in a moment, but 2020 hindsight, you're never alone. Seek out, like what Sarah and Andrea were saying, seek out your allies. Seek out other women of color who are maybe in the same industry. Maybe it's not within the same organization or company as you, and maybe you may be in that sole position, but look to other wineries or look to other organizations where you might have peers who are also fighting this fight, and you can share those best practices. I recently joined BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous, and People of Color network for California environmental workers. And we're scattered across the state. We work in various city and county and state departments and organizations, but we're sharing best practices, we're sharing jobs, we're talking about what does it mean to advocate for ourselves within an organization. I would also say, in terms of within your own organization, start doing some power mapping, thinking about who are your allies, what positions do they hold, and how can you talk to them? If you know your coworkers, if you're friends with them, like Sarah and Andrea said, be honest with them, tell them what you need and why you need it, and how they could be helpful to you as you're advocating for something within a space. So I think letting folks know that you need that help, seeking it out, and then also knowing that there are folks who might be able to wield their power or their privilege to help you in advocating for what you're looking for.
I would piggyback on that and say, Gabriella, take care of yourself. Therapy is a wonderful thing. If you don't have someone that you can talk to, finding someone that you can talk to, whether it be a professional or, a close friend or an ally, but recognizing that this is a marathon, and that as a former runner 20 years and 40 pounds ago, I will tell you that there is a season in which you train and a season in which you take off, because you have to rest in order to be able to run the race next time. And so it is okay to take time for yourself, to rejuvenate yourself. That's also why I say, absorb the fun parts of different cultures. It's not always the traumatic parts, but it's okay to rest and care for yourself so that you can be a part of the marathon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of those responses.
We are at 11 o'clock, but if there's any last question, and we can always, I will send out the panelists' contact information in the email that you'll get afterwards, as well as the recording. Tauri will be back with us for our June webinar as well to discuss more on the DEI front. So we look forward to that. And then hopefully someday soon we'll have her in person so we can do some fun improv workshop things. I'm very excited. We also have our next all-member meeting on June 17th. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Wednesday. So we will talk about the reopening of the economy. At that point, we will have all of our information by then, and John will be there to give us an update on that. So that'll be fantastic. Locals Day starts next Thursday in Yountville. So if you need an excuse to come to Yountville and drink half-price margaritas from La Calenda, or $10 cocktails at the estate, or free corkage at Bouchon, it's a good excuse to come up every Thursday starting next Thursday. I think that's it. I don't think I'm missing anything else. So have a great Memorial Day weekend, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate all your support and your willingness to work in this space, and we will continue to have these conversations with everyone that is willing to do the work. So thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.